At 23:47 on a night when the Ardennes seemed determined to swallow every sound and every soul, the door of the C-47 yawned open over a world of white nothing. Wine clawed at the men clustered around the opening, a freezing hand dragging tears from their eyes and breath from their throats. Sergeant David Miller, 24 years old, 11 combat jumps behind him and more regrets than he cared to count, stood with his boots on the metal lip, fingers curled around the edge of the fuselage. There was nothing out there, no horizon, no ground, no stars. Just fog, thick and luminous in the aircraft's running lights, turning the night into a milky void. Before the war, he had known fog as something different. Back in Ohio, it had clung low over the river on autumn mornings, soft and harmless, a nuisance that slowed trucks on the road to the factory. He had driven through it in a battered flatbed, headlights cutting useless cones in the white, trusting yellow lines and instinct. Here, over the frozen forests around Bastogne, fog felt like a living thing that had risen from the snow itself to wrap around the plane and say, "You do not belong in my sky." Behind David, the inside of the C-47 was a vibrating tunnel of dim red light and tense faces. The aircraft shuddered periodically as the pilot fought invisible currents. Nylon static lines hung from the overhead cable like pale snakes, attached to 18 parachutes and 18 men. At their feet, lashed to the floor with doubled cords, sat the reason for this insane flight: 5 heavy bundles wrapped in canvas and netting, each stuffed with ammunition and medical supplies. Ammunition for rifles and machine guns in Bastogne, where the 101st were digging in against German armor. Boxes of plasma that could be the difference between a man bleeding out in the aid station and one who got up to fight another day. Somewhere below, in that fog and darkness, were roughly 500 men counting hours and rounds and wondering which would run out first. The plane lurched, someone cursed, an empty ration tin rolled along the deck and clanged against a boot. The radio up in the cockpit crackled with a half-heard plea from the ground, something about low on artillery shells, about German tanks probing the lines. The loadmaster, a thin sergeant with a perpetual chewing motion in his jaw, shouted over the engine drone. 2 minutes to decide if they were going to jump into a place they could not see. David glanced at his men. They were a hand-picked stick from the parachute infantry, pulled together in less than a day when the call had gone out for volunteers who knew the terrain around Bastogne. A few were veterans of Normandy, like him. Others had first tasted combat in Holland and carried those scars still fresh. Private Lewis, 19, from Tennessee, eyes too bright, fingers worrying the rosary in his pocket. Corporal Sam Rodriguez, 27, wiry and sharp, who had once driven mules along mountain paths in New Mexico and liked to say there was no trail he could not find in the dark. Johnson, a former high school teacher, who had brought his habit of quietly correcting mistakes into war and turned it into an uncanny sense for maps. 18 souls, plus the pilots and aircrew, riding a metal tube into the unknown. "Where are we?" David shouted toward the cockpit, leaning close to the bulkhead. The navigator answered without turning, voice strained. "Somewhere over the damned corridor." Fog rolled up from the valleys. "I can barely see the gauges, let alone the ground. Our beacons are useless. The Bastogne boys are firing flares, but the soup is too thick. I get a fix every time we pass over a battery or a town, then it is gone." The pilot, a major with a face carved by too many night flights, shook his head minutely. "We are flying blind, Sergeant. We missed the drop zone by a mile in this, and your boys land in German laps. Or in trees they do not walk away from." An impact hammered the fuselage like a giant hand. The plane shivered, dipping several feet. Somewhere outside, artillery had reached up and almost found them. Shrapnel rattled against the skin, a clatter that made every man flinch. The loadmaster swore, looking up at the ceiling as if he could see the holes. The radio crackled again. A voice came through, ground-based, distorted by distance and bad weather but urgent enough to cut through the noise. "Loose talk is useless. Bastogne is low on everything. If those drops do not get through, we do not hold. Repeat, we do not hold. We have wounded without blood, guns without bullets. If you see nothing, you drop on coordinates and pray." David closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Somewhere inside his ribcage, an old ache stirred. Normandy. His first combat drop had been into the hedgerows of France, in the earliest hours of June. They had trained for it for months, memorizing sandtable models, practicing night landings. The night itself had not cared. Flak storms had scattered the C-47s across the sky. Red tracer lines had turned the darkness into a lethal geometry. The green light had gone on too early, the pilot too eager to lighten the load. David's stick had jumped on a signal that had seemed correct at the time and landed miles from their designated drop zone. He could still feel the snap of the parachute harness on his thighs, the violent tug as the canopy blossomed, the sickening realization as he drifted down through scattered cloud that the landmarks below were wrong. No causeways where they should have been, no gapped hedgerows. The radio beacon had failed. They had spent hours in the dark, gathering lost men, feeling their way past German patrols, finally stumbling into a firefight over a crossroads that needed holding. They had helped in the end, but another platoon, the one meant to cover an approach to the causeway, had never received their share of ammunition. David had watched them from a ditch as they ran out of rounds, one by one, rifles going silent, bayonets fixed in desperation. He had watched men he knew die with empty magazines at their feet and a helpless fury in their eyes. He had carried that with him through Holland, through cold training jumps over English fields. He had promised himself that if he ever had the chance again, he would not let the supplies go astray. No wrong field, no wrong hedgerow. Now he stood at the edge of another open door, looking down into a fog that erased everything. The navigator's voice came again, closer this time as the man leaned back. "If we turn around," he said, "we can try again when the fog lifts. Daylight. Visual markers. It will be safer." Daylight would also mean that any German battery within 10 kilometers would see every supply plane coming and line up their sights. Safe for the men in the aircraft, maybe? Not for the ones already freezing in Bastogne's foxholes. The pilot's words came tight. "I am not afraid to turn this bird around if the drop is hopeless. No point in 18 of you breaking ankles in some forest, but it is your call, Sergeant. You are the one they will be waiting on down there." The irony was bitter. The man with the least visibility had the clearest say. David looked again at the fog. It swirled, faintly glowing red where the plane's interior light spilled out. Below, in that churned white, there could be trees, fields, a town, a German column marching. There could be nothing. He checked his wristwatch. They had learned to navigate by time. When landmarks failed, how long it took to fly between two known points at a given speed and heading. Their last solid position had been over a small town whose church bell tower the navigator had glimpsed cutting through the fog. West of Bastogne, they had flown another 14 minutes since then on a straight course. "Johnson," David said, jerking his chin toward the schoolteacher-turned-soldier. "Do the math." Johnson already had his own watch out, lips moving. "Assuming we held heading and speed," he murmured, "we should be just about over the corridor. If the wind did not push us too far north, if," someone muttered. "If," David echoed. War was full of those. The loadmaster checked the bundles, tugging at knots. Each canvas-wrapped load had a parachute of its own, a delayed opening rig meant to keep it from tearing apart on impact. Those bundles contained enough rifle ammunition and machine gun belts to restock a battalion, plus metal tins of plasma. Each crate was a promise made to men in holes in the ground. Coming. Hold on. Coming. He imagined Bastogne. He had not been there, but he had heard the situation described. A pocket of resistance in a ring of German steel. American paratroopers dug into frozen earth, relying on short rations and stubbornness. Tanks on every road leading in. Artillery hemming them in, trees shattered, snow-stained. 500 men, at least, who needed these crates. Some he would never know. Some he might recognize by face later, if there was a later. He thought of Normandy's empty magazines, of the helpless look in a sergeant's eyes as he pressed his last 2 rounds into a private's hand. He thought of his promise. David lifted his head and shouted toward the cockpit. "We go on. We are close enough. Fog or no fog, they need this tonight. You get us as close to their coordinates as you can. We will do the rest." The pilot's shoulders tensed and then dropped, as if some inner struggle had resolved. "Understood, Sergeant," he said, and his voice lost its hesitation. "We hold course. 1 pass only. When you go fast." The loadmaster's voice came again, more urgent. 1 minute, the plane's red interior light seemed to pulse with the word. Men checked straps, tugged helmets, slapped one another's shoulders. The ritual soothed nerves. Rodriguez winked at David. "Chasing roads in the dark again, Sarge. Just like home, no. Just like home, David answered, though the only roads down there now were made of ice and fear. He moved to the front of the stick, as he always did. The wine from the open door tore at his uniform, rifling through his thoughts. He imagined the drop zone as it had been drawn on the map, a snow-covered field northwest of Bastogne, bordered by tree lines, with a low ridge to the east. They had chosen it because it was within reach of the encircled forces but supposedly clear of major German units. Seeing it had been the plan. Seeing it was now impossible. Green light, the loadmaster yelled. For a moment, nothing happened. The light glowed like an accusation. Then David stepped forward into the white. There was a brief sensation of standing on nothing, of the world dropping away so quickly his body forgot where it belonged. The roar of engines vanished as if a door had closed. Fog slapped his face, cold and wet. For a heartbeat or two, there was no up, no down, only the violent tug on his harness as his static line played out and yanked his parachute from its pack. The canopy blossomed above him with a sharp crack and a rush of deceleration that hauled him upright. The straps dug into his legs and shoulders. He dropped into a slower, swaying fall. The world remained white. He could hear others' faint curses, shouted numbers. One man's panicked yell cut off as the canopy opened. Somewhere above, the heavy bundles tumbled, their own chutes needing a few seconds more to deploy. Training kicked in. When you cannot see, you listen. He strained his ears. The wind had a direction, pushing him cold on one cheek, less on the other. He twisted in his harness, turning his body to face into it, trying to keep the canopy from swinging wildly. The fog muted noise, but not completely. He heard a distant rumble, like a faraway train, artillery. And under it, a staccato thudding that he knew as machine guns. Closer, the crunch and crackle of branches, whipping past his boots. Tree, someone shouted in the mist, voice too close. Leaves and twigs brushed his legs. He tucked his knees slightly, teeth clenched. A dark-shaped loom trunk, thicker than he wanted to see at a speed like this. His boots hit first, then his body swung forward, slamming into rough bark. The harness jerked, pain flared in his chest where a branch gouged between ribs. For a second he hung there, gasping, held against the tree's side like some strange fruit. He had practiced tree landings in training, once in a controlled course with soft ground beneath. This was not that. His knife hand fumbled for the sheathed blade at his chest, fingers numb. He cut one riser, then another, letting the canopy sag further, transferring weight. The tree creaked. Below, vague shapes suggested ground, but he could not judge distance. The fog turned everything into ghostly silhouettes. He did what they had been taught to do when there was no good option. Breathed once, cursed softly, and dropped. The fall was shorter than he had feared. He hit snow and hard earth in a painful sprawl, rolled, and ended up on his back, the parachute collapsing over him like a cold, wet blanket. For a moment he lay still, listening for the sound of German voices, the crack of rifles. Only the distant thunder of artillery answered, and the nearer rustle of someone else fighting their way free of a canopy. He shoved the thin fabric aside and sat up. The fog around him glowed faintly. He could see the trunks of trees, dark columns rising up, their upper halves lost in white. A forest, not an open field. The drop zone had been misplaced, no surprise. The question now was, how badly, Louis, he called softly. Here came a whisper off to his right. In a tree. Again, Rodriguez's low laugh followed. You are a squirrel, amigo, it is natural. Voices came in from the mist, one by one. They were scattered, but not hopelessly. 10 men, 12, 14. There were groans. One man had landed badly and twisted an ankle. Another cursed as he cut away a parachute that had snagged around his neck. A bundle crashed through branches not far away, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Relief threaded through the fear. At least some of the ammunition and plasma had come down with them. They gathered as best they could under the trees, clutching rifles, blinking snow and fog from eyelashes. David counted in a low voice. 16 besides himself, 2 men unaccounted for. We might find them later, Johnson said quietly, or they might be finding us. No sense shouting their names and advertising to the world we arrived. The forest muffled sound, but not entirely. Somewhere to their left, engines grumbled. Several, in convoy, German, closer than he liked. We are not on the northwest field, Rodriguez murmured. Too many trees, too much traffic nearby. We hit woods close to a main road. David pulled a small map from his thigh pocket, shielding it from the damp with his body and his helmet. They had studied this sheet for hours before boarding. Now he tried to superimpose the faint lines on the indistinct shapes around them: roads, forest patches, elevation contour lines. What if the fog pushed them off course? Johnson whispered, leaning close. If they held heading but drifted with the wind, we could be south of the planned zone, or east. A new sound cut through the others, shouted commands in German, the metallic clink of weapons. Very close now. The men instinctively sank lower, backs to trunks. Light flickered in the white. A vehicle's headlamps dimmed, probing the forest edge. We are near a roadblock, David said under his breath. Could be one of the rings around Bastogne, if we are behind it. Behind the German line that was choking off the town. Behind the roadblock that might be waiting to ambush any relief column trying to reach the encircled troops. His mind raced. The planned drop had been to the northwest. If they were south or east instead, blessed by a combination of fog and drift, they might have fallen almost perfectly into a blind spot in the German encirclement, a gap between units, or behind a screening force. Or they might be a stone's throw from a whole company of Wehrmacht infantry. Options, he whispered. We can sit here and hope the fog hides us until dawn, then try to move. Or we can move now, in the dark, with the enemy so close we can hear them clearing their throats. Rodriguez shifted his weight. If those engines belong to a blocking force, and if they are moving into position, we may not have a later. A burst of laughter drifted through the trees from the direction of the road. German voices. Someone told a joke David could not understand, but the cadence was unmistakable. Louis, still half caught in his branches, whispered hoarsely, "You said 500 men in Bastogne are waiting for this stuff." We sit and wait. They run out of time. Normandy reached up again from memory, dragging guilt with it. Men in a hedgerow, counting their last bullets. Gather what we can, David said. Bundles, wounded, weapons. Quiet as church mice. We find out where that road is. If there is a chance to slip behind them, we take it. If there is not, we go around. One way or another, these crates reach our lines. It was absurd. 18 scattered paratroopers, a handful of supply bundles, no clear landmarks, and an invisible enemy line between them and Bastogne. Absurd, but wars had hinged on less. Rodriguez's smile was a flash of teeth in the fog. You always wanted a challenge, Sarge. David did not answer. He knelt in the snow, fingers already numb, and traced a rough route on the map with a gloved finger. The fog around them thickened, pulled tight around the trunks like a curtain. Somewhere beyond, engines revved and men laughed. Somewhere further, huddled in foxholes under tree bursts and cold, 500 men gripped rifles with too few rounds and waited for dawn. In a night when the sky had disappeared, a truck driver from Ohio turned para, guided by guilt, instinct, and a battered wristwatch, began to walk his small group through a forest the enemy thought impassable. Every crunch of snow under his boots felt like a drumbeat counting down. Every crate they dragged felt like a promise not yet broken. They had no idea that the fog that had swallowed their drop zone had also obscured them from German spotters, that the drift that had thrown them off the planned zone had put them behind a key roadblock, or that the choices they were about to make in the next few hours would decide whether an entire sector in Bastogne held or collapsed. They only knew that they had jumped, that they were alive, and that somewhere in the white distance, men they had never met were waiting on bullets and blood that were currently sitting in the snow at their feet. And that, as far as David Miller was concerned, was reason enough to move. The fog thickened as they moved, swallowing shapes just a few meters away and turning every tree into a looming shadow. David had spent his life before the war judging distance by headlights and fence posts along country roads. Here, the world ended at arm's length. He forced himself to slow down, to resist the urge to rush. Rushing in fog got you killed on an Ohio backroad or in a Belgian forest. Keep a hand on the man in front of you, he whispered. If you lose contact, you stop where you are and hiss, do not shout. They improvised a file. Rodriguez took point, his mountain instincts tuned to small changes in ground underfoot. David walked a few paces behind, map in one hand, the other trailing along tree trunks as a crude guide. Johnson hovered close, whispering bearings and corrections. The wounded man with the twisted ankle leaned on Lewis and another paratrooper, teeth gritted. Two of the supply bundles had landed close enough to retrieve quickly. Men grunted as they dragged them across the snow, the canvas leaving long grooves. The third had hung up in a tree, swaying like some bizarre pinata. They cut it down with muttered curses, catching it as it fell to keep the parachute from flapping noisily. "We leave the fourth and fifth for now," David decided, voice low but firm. "We mark the trees. If we make it through, we come back with more bodies. Right now, moving is more important than being Santa Claus," no one argued. They had all heard the engines. After a few dozen cautious steps, the trees ahead thinned. The fog glowed a little brighter, reflecting off a small clearing. Beyond, shapes lurked too linear to be natural. Rodriguez raised a fist and dropped to a knee. The line behind him froze, one by one. David crawled forward until he lay beside the point man, belly on the cold ground, snow seeping into his jacket. He peered through the thin line of brush at the edge of the trees. A road cut across the landscape, a pale band of packed snow and rutted ice. On it, half shrouded by fog, a German roadblock crouched like some ugly insect. Wooden sawhorses and logs formed an improvised barrier. Two trucks sat idling, exhaust plumes mixing with the mist. Men in field gray uniforms stamped their feet against the cold, rifles slung. A machine gun on a tripod pointed down the road toward Bastogne, its barrel hooded with a canvas cover against frost. Every few seconds, a sentry turned and peered into the trees, though his gaze slid past the place where David and Rodriguez lay. "Blocking force," Rodriguez breathed. "These men are not just passing through." Johnson inched up beside them. "If this is the southeast approach," he murmured, "then Bastogne is that way." He nodded past the roadblock. "And any convoy trying to bring supplies would come from the opposite direction." Straight into this, David's mind mapped it out. The Germans had learned the same lessons about choke points he had in Normandy. You did not need to be everywhere. You just needed to be in the right place when your enemy tried to move. "We could try to go around," Lewis whispered behind them. "Find a gap." "Maybe," David said. "But those men out there are the reason nothing is getting through. We slip around and sneak to Bastogne. We help 500 men for a day or two. We take out that gun and those trucks. We might help a lot more than that." He felt the weight of the bundles behind him, the weight of choices. They were 18 men with limited ammunition, in bad visibility, up against an unknown number of Germans who had vehicles and a fixed position. Attacking them head-on would be suicide. But head-on was not the only way. "Look at the fog," Johnson murmured. "They cannot see the trees clearly. They might not see us if we move parallel, just inside the line, flank left." Rodriguez suggested, "Get behind them." David thought of something his old trucking boss had once said when faced with a blocked highway: "If you cannot go through, you go around. And if you cannot go around, you make a new road." He pulled the men close, forming a tight knot among the trunks. Faces loomed out of the white, eyes tense but steady. "Listen up," he whispered. "We did not just land behind them by accident. Fog pushed us here for a reason. We are going to make the most of it. Rodriguez and I will take 4 men around to their right, keeping to the trees. We get behind the trucks, find as much cover as we can. Johnson, you take the rest and prepare to hit them from this side when you hear the first shot. No one fires early. We go for the gun and the crew first, then the drivers. We keep it as short and as loud as possible." "What about the bundles?" someone asked. "We bring one," David said. "If we try to drag them all, we will sound like a herd of elk. The others stay under guard. We come back for them once the roadblock is down." It was a gamble piled on a gamble. But if they could tear a hole in this line, not only could their own supplies slip through, they might open a path for others' trucks, tanks, wounded evacuation. The thought steadied something in him. They split. Rodriguez's team faded left into the trees, moving with surprising grace for men burdened with gear. David went with them, his boots finding purchase more by feel than sight. The fog hugged close, turning each step into a guess. Every snapped twig sounded like a rifle shot. A branch scraped his helmet, sending a shower of frost onto his neck. After what felt like an eternity but was probably just a few minutes, the faint glow of the road appeared ahead and below. They had curved around the German position. The truck's rear ends loomed out of the mist, dark and hulking. One had a tarp over its cargo bed, sagging with collected snow. The other's bed was empty, a canvas cover rolled up. A single sentry stood by the back of the nearer vehicle, smoking, his rifle leaning against the bumper. Rodriguez touched David's shoulder and pointed. Around the trucks, barrels, crates, and a stack of logs offered broken cover. If they timed it right, they could be within a few paces before the sentry even realized shapes were moving. Behind them, in the deeper trees, Johnson and the others would be crouched on the opposite side of the road, invisible but listening. Waiting for the first crack, David's heart beat slow and heavy in his chest. Not fear, not exactly, but an awareness of the weight of the next 30 seconds. He signaled with hand gestures to fingers toward the sentry, then a chopping motion. Rodriguez nodded, already moving into position to take the man quietly if possible. They crept forward, snow muffling their steps. The sentry exhaled smoke, watching it drift lazily. His gaze wandered across the road, not into the trees. He shifted his weight, one boot scrunching the frost. Rodriguez lunged, one arm looping around the German's neck, the other hand clamping over his mouth. The man stiffened, boots scrabbling against the ground, but the sound he made was swallowed by the fog and engine noise. David stepped in and drove his knife up under the man's ribcage, quick and sure. The body went limp. He felt a familiar chill not from the air, but from the act itself. He had killed before. It never became easy. It just became more practiced. They eased the body down behind a barrel. The engines continued to purr. The muffled conversation from the roadblock's center went on, oblivious. David took position behind the truck, rifle up. He could barely see the machine gun emplacement now that he was behind it, just the vague shapes of men and sandbags. He raised his hand and counted silently. 1, 2, 3. He fired the first shot. The German nearest the gun pitched sideways, his helmet flying. A half-second later, Johnson's group opened up from the opposite tree line. Muzzle flashes strobed in the fog, outlining men and shapes with harsh, brief clarity. Bullets slapped into wood, metal, flesh. Someone shouted in German, voice high with surprise and fear. A flare shot up, but the fog turned it into a diffuse glow, more confusing than illuminating. David worked his rifle by instinct. Aim, squeeze, cycle. A man running toward the trucks jerked and fell. Another dove behind a log, then writhed as a burst from a Thompson found him anyway. The machine gun team tried to swing the weapon toward the trees, but Rodriguez had already sprinted to the flank. He fired a burst that cut through the gunner. The barrel sagged. The whole engagement took less than a minute. The last German, realizing he was alone, turned to flee down the road. Lewis, of all people, stepped out from the trees and fired a single, shaky shot that caught the man in the back. He fell, skidding in the snow. Silence crashed down, as sudden as the gunfire had erupted. Only the truck's engines, still idling, disrupted it. "Hold your fire," David called softly. "Listen." They waited. No answering fire came. No shouts from some hidden reserve. The fog, once again, was their ally. "Clear the position," he ordered. "Fast, check bodies." "Kill the engines." Men surged forward, nervous energy venting in motion. Someone twisted keys. The trucks coughed and went quiet. The machine gun, its crew sprawled around it, sat mute at last. Johnson kicked over a crate with his boot, revealing neatly stacked ammunition for German rifles. "Useful for the enemy, dead weight for them." "Road's ours, for now," Rodriguez said. "How long until someone comes looking for this lot?" "Long enough to get our bundles across," David replied. "Maybe long enough for more." They dragged the captured obstacles aside, creating a narrow gap. Then they went back into the trees for the remaining supply bundles. Men who had minutes ago been exchanging fire now strained under shared loads, walking awkwardly across the cleared patch. Each bundle thumped into the back of the nearer truck bed with a satisfying weight. Canvas against wood, lives against danger. Johnson leaned against the side of the vehicle, chest heaving. "If we drive this," he said between breaths, "we are one big target on a road the Germans know. If we leave it, we are dragging these things by hand." "We drive," David said, "but not far. We get closer to the perimeter, then ditch it before we get into their artillery's laps. The fog is still thick. With a German truck and German coats, we might slide past a few watchful eyes." Lewis blinked. "You want us to pretend to be Krauts. I want to get these crates to Bastogne before dawn," David said. "Whatever it takes." Within 10 minutes, They had the nearest truck loaded with their bundles and whatever extra ammunition might be repurposed. Two of the paratroopers stripped jackets and helmets from the German dead, disguises by necessity. Rodriguez took the driver's seat, having declared he could drive anything with wheels and some stubbornness. David sat beside him, helmet low, collar up, rifle across his lap out of sight. The others trotted alongside, close to the ditches, using the vehicle as moving cover. Any German patrol that caught a glimpse through the fog would see a familiar silhouette and a small silhouettes of men around it. Nothing to worry about, they hoped. The truck rumbled forward, gears grinding softly. The fog swallowed the road behind them. Ahead, the white curtain parted only enough to reveal 10 meters at a time. It was like driving into a forever unfolding wall. Twice they had to slow as ghostly shapes appeared ahead, other vehicles, perhaps, or road signs. Once, a German dispatch rider on a motorcycle came out of the fog toward them, head down, scarf up. He zipped past with a muttered curse at the visibility, never even turning to look. Each time, David's heart slammed against his ribs. He had the strange sensation of being both exposed and completely unseen. After perhaps 20 minutes of this tense crawl, the sharp, flat cracks of American rifles filtered in from the distance on their right. The pattern was different from German fire, shorter bursts, more chaotic. Somewhere beyond the wall of white, their own were fighting. "Time to leave the taxicab," David said. "Find us a good ditch." Rodriguez pulled the truck off the road at a shallow angle. The wheels bumped down into a low depression. They killed the engine and bailed, hands already reaching for the bundles. Within moments, the vehicle was silent, another lump in the fog. "From here, we go on foot," David said. "Follow the sound. When you start hearing Americans swearing, we are close." The nearer they got to Bastogne's encircled perimeter, the more the world sharpened. Fog thinned slightly, enough that occasional muzzle flashes painted skeletal trees in orange. The ground underfoot showed the scars of recent shelling, craters, churned mud frozen in jagged formations. A faint smell of burned cordite and pine filled the air. A challenge call sliced through the night. "Halt, where da?" The German phrase was delivered with a distinctly American accent. Rodriguez raised both hands and shouted back. "Santa Claus," and a late delivery. There was a pause. Then a different voice, wary but hopeful, "Advance and be recognized." They stepped out of the mist like ghosts, bundles in tow. Figures emerged from shallow foxholes and behind snow-covered logs, men in American helmets, faces gaunt, eyes ringed with exhaustion. A corporal with a bandaged hand stared at the canvas-wrapped loads as if seeing a mirage. "You boys lost?" he asked, though his gaze did not leave the bundles. David shook his head, feeling a strange, fierce joy bubble up under his fatigue. "No, Corporal," he said. "We are exactly where we needed to be." They carried the crates into a small hollow that passed for a forward supply point. A medic tore open the plasma tins with shaking hands. A machine gunner ran his fingers over the linked belts as if counting each round physically made them more real. Word spread along the line in quick, disbelieving sentences. Paratroopers who had been down to their last magazines suddenly had boxes to share. An officer arrived, breath misting in the bitter air, helmet askew. He searched for insignia on David's coat, then gave up and simply stuck out his hand. "Captain Harris," he said, "you have no idea what you just did." David took the hand. "Sergeant Miller, we heard you were running low." Harris laughed once, the sound edged with hysteria and relief. "Low? We were 2 hours from dry. The crowds were massing for another push at first light. If we had gotten hit with what we had left," he shook his head, words failing. "Then you have some more breathing room," David said. "Use it well." It was only later, after a blur of hours spent helping shuttle rounds to gun pits, plasma to aid stations, and messages along the line, that someone put numbers to it. About 500 men in that sector of the Bastogne perimeter had been counting cartridges bullet by bullet. The sudden influx from the night drop and the captured German roadblock had not only kept their rifles firing. It had given them the extra punch to repulse a major assault that came just before dawn. From their foxholes, firing into the whitening fog, they could not see the bigger picture. They just knew their guns did not quit when the enemy kept coming. They knew that when the Germans finally pulled back, leaving bodies in the snow, they were still alive to see the sun creep up through the mist. For David, the battle was a haze of muzzle flashes, shouted commands, the dull ache in his shoulders from passing ammo boxes hand to hand. He saw men he had never met before fight with a kind of desperate precision that only came from knowing there was nowhere to go and nothing to fall back on. He saw medics hook up plasma to pale arms, watched color creep back into cheeks that had been halfway to gray. Sometime in the late morning, when the worst of the attack had been beaten back, he found himself sitting on an ammunition crate, fingers too numb to feel the tin cup of coffee someone had pressed into his hands. Steam rose and vanished in the cold air. Harris sat beside him. "We had you marked as a supply drop that would probably go wide," the captain said. Pilot radioed that the fog turned the sky into milk. "We expected crates in a farm field 10 miles away, if they even came down intact. Instead we get you on our doorstep and a roadblock behind us cleared out. I would call that providence, if I still believed in neat explanations. Fog messed up the plan," David said quietly. "It always does. But sometimes it messes with the other guy more." Harris studied him for a moment. "You done this kind of thing before?" "Not like this," David admitted. "Normandy, Holland. I have had my share of bad landings and worse choices. This is the first time the drift worked in our favor, though." Harris nodded slowly. "Whatever promise you had made, consider it paid forward. You saved more men than you will ever meet." That night, as the sky cleared a little and stars pricked through, the fog that had ruled the previous hours began to thin. The world regained edges. Trees had crowns again. The road they had seized lay quiet, German bodies already stiffening where they had fallen. Bastogne remained encircled, but the ring had a weak spot now, a place where American patrols could slip out and back with slightly less risk. Convoys, when they could, would later use the gap created by that destroyed roadblock as part of their erratic, dangerous routes in. Weeks later, when the bulge was pushed back and lines stabilized, someone in a headquarters far from the snow wrote a short paragraph in a report about night resupply drops successfully delivered under low visibility conditions, contributing materially to the defense of Bastogne. The phrase "saved approximately 500 men in sector" appeared as a neat estimate in a margin. No one mentioned the truck, or the way Rodriguez had laughed as he strangled a sentry in a fog bank, or the look on the medic's face as he opened the first plasma crate. Months after that, David stood in a quiet corner of a stateside airfield, looking at a blackboard covered in diagrams. He was instructing a fresh class of paratroopers about night drops, about wind drift, about what to do when you could not see your own boots. He told them the technical parts: check your lines, trust your instruments, use your ears. He did not tell them about the knot in his stomach as he had stepped into the white, or the way killing a man from behind in the fog had felt less like combat and more like a grim chore. But sometimes, when a question came, "Sergeant, what if everything goes wrong?" he would pause a little longer than necessary and say, "Sometimes, when everything goes wrong, you get a chance you would not have had otherwise. Your job is to be ready to see it." Years later still, a historian piecing together accounts of Bastogne would notice a curious overlap. German reports complaining about a lost roadblock and confused action in heavy mist on one road. American testimonies mentioning a sudden influx of ammunition and medical supplies in one sector, just before a German assault failed. A few veterans remembered some crazy night drop and a bunch of para boys who seemed to come out of nowhere from the fog. Someone coined a phrase in a draft article: "when fog swallowed the skies over Bastogne." One blind night drop delivered the ammunition that saved 500 men. It sounded dramatic, almost too neat. Editors liked it. The numbers were rounded, the cause and effect simplified, but the core was true enough. For David Miller, now older, shoulders a little stooped, hair flecked with gray, the headline would have made him uncomfortable. He would have pointed out that no one action ever saved that many men alone, that hundreds of small axe foxholes dug deeper, guns sighted better, medics working longer had all woven together. He would have downplayed his own part. But in quiet moments, when the world outside his window was misty and the hum of distant traffic sounded like idling truck engines, he would think back to that night when he had stood at the edge of the C-47's open door and chosen to step into nothing. He would remember the feeling of the fog closing over him, of the branch scraping his ribs, of the map damp in his hand, of the German roadblock suddenly laid bare in milky light. He would think of Normandy and magazines running dry, and Bastogne and belts fed freshly into hungry machine guns. He would acknowledge, if only to himself, that some promises could not be undone but could, sometimes, be balanced. Fog had swallowed the skies over Bastogne. A blind night drop, half guided by instinct and half by guilt, had found its way through. 500 men had greeted dawn with ammunition in their rifles instead of empty chambers. The war rolled on, indifferent as always, but in that small pocket of forest and snow, what one man carried on his back and in his heart had mattered more than any arrow on a high command's map. And that, for a former truck driver from Ohio, who had once known only the feel of steering wheels and gear shifts, was enough. At the end of the war, David stepped off the transport ship in New York with a duffel bag that felt much lighter than the weight he had been carrying in his chest. The city roared around him with lights and noise and people who had not seen a battlefield in their lives, but he still walked as if a sudden shell might come in from nowhere. Crowds made him tense. Fog made him quieter. He took a train back to Ohio, sat by the window as fields blurred past, and watched early morning mist cling to the low ground. It looked different now, both gentler and more dangerous, as if he could see all the futures it might be hiding. Back home, the trucking company took him back without hesitation. They needed drivers, and he knew every back road and loading dock in 3 counties. When he slid behind the wheel of a civilian truck again, the familiarity of it almost hurt. The engine's rumble was softer than a C-47's. The cab smelled of oil and coffee instead of canvas and fear. But the old skills were still there. He could judge the distance of a curve in the dark, feel when black ice lurked under the tires. On foggy nights, when his headlights pushed against a wall of white on some country road, he found himself smiling grimly. Compared to Bastogne, this was easy. There were no machine guns at the end of this route, no 500 men depending on whether he hit the exact right patch of ground. He married a girl he had written to from Europe, a woman who had worked in a factory welding seams on fuel tanks. They built a small life together, modest house, 2 children, Sunday dinners, overdue bills. He almost never talked about the war in detail. If people asked, he said he had been a paratrooper, that he had jumped into Normandy and Holland and the Bulge. When pressed, he had a single line ready about Bastogne. It was cold, and we got lucky when we needed it. That satisfied most. Only every now and then did the past push through the present with enough force that he had to speak. Once, his son came home from school full of excitement, waving a thin history book. "We learned about the Battle of the Bulge today," the boy said. "They said Bastogne was surrounded but some planes dropped supplies in. Saved the day." He recited the textbook line with the clear innocence of someone for whom history was a story with clean edges. David took the book, scanned the paragraph. There it was. Despite bad weather, resupply missions brought ammunition and medical supplies to the defenders, contributing to the successful holding of the town. No mention of fog so thick you could not see your boots, or of a roadblock ripped open in the night. "Is it right?" his son asked. "Were you there?" "Yes," David said, after a moment. "It is right enough. They keep it simple so it fits on the page. There was a lot more to it than that, but the important part is true. Men needed supplies, and some got through." His son nodded, satisfied. Later, when the boy was asleep, David sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands and stared at nothing. His wife, who knew when to wait him out, eventually sat opposite him. "You thinking about that night again?" She asked softly. "You know how they put it in the book," he said, like it was some clean operation. Aircraft here, Bastogne there, line drawn between. No mention of how many things could have gone wrong. No mention of what we had to do to make it right. She tilted her head. "Do you wish they would tell it all?" He thought about that. "If they told it all," he said slowly, "they'd have to put in the things that are hard to live with. The men who did not make it. The ones we left in the trees, the sentry I took from behind so he would not shout. They would have to put in the doubt, the fear, the fact that we were never sure until the end that we had done more good than harm. I am not sure a school book can carry all that, but you do," she said quietly. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do." Time passed. The scar on his ribs from the tree branch faded to a pale line. His knees ached in damp weather, a souvenir of too many hard landings. He drove trucks, raised kids, fixed leaky roofs. Every December, when the cold snapped and a low mist rolled over the fields, he found himself looking out across the white and thinking of a Belgian forest and a truck he should not have been driving. On the 20th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, a letter arrived, printed on heavy paper. A veterans association was organizing a trip to Europe for those who had served in Bastogne. There would be ceremonies, speeches, visits to old positions. A small note on the bottom mentioned a proposed plaque dedicated to airborne resupply operations that proved critical to the town's survival. He hesitated. Part of him never wanted to see those woods again. Another part knew he was one of the few who could still point to the exact kind of fog that had fallen that night. He went. The Ardennes in peacetime looked superficially similar. The trees still stood, though many were second growth, planted after shells had turned their predecessors into splinters. The ground, once ripped by artillery, had healed into soft undulations. Bastogne, rebuilt and busy, bore its scars in plaques and museums rather than in missing walls. Families strolled where foxholes had once been. Children played in fields where crates had crashed down. On the outskirts, near a stretch of road now neatly paved, a small ceremony took place. A stone marker, waist-high, had been set into the ground beside a line of younger trees. An inscription, in English and French, spoke of night drops through fog and fire and supplies delivered at great risk to those who held the line. The historian leading the group turned to David, having been tipped off by someone that he had been on one of the drops. "Can you tell us," the man asked in careful English, "what it was like that night, flying blind over the forest?" David looked at the marker, at the few dozen people gathered around, some veterans in suits with rows of ribbons, some local families, some younger soldiers in modern uniforms. He could have given them the clean version, the kind they expected, terrifying but necessary, comradeship, duty. He could have fed the legend that had grown around that headline line about saving 500 men. Instead, he took a breath and let the complicated version out, as far as words would allow. "It was like this," he said. "You could not see your hand in front of your face. You could not see the town you were aiming for, or the field you were supposed to land in. All you had was a watch, a heading, and what you thought the wind was doing. We were scared. We jumped anyway, because the men down there were more scared than we were and had fewer options." He glanced toward the trees. "We landed in the wrong place, by every measure they had put in the plan. Not the field, not the grid reference. We fell into trees, in a patch of woods where no one intended us to be. That wrong place happened to put us behind a German roadblock that was strangling this road. We took it out because by then, doing nothing was not an option. We drove one of their trucks toward your lines because dragging those crates would have taken too long. We got away with it because the fog that had made the drop line also hid us from their eyes." He met their gazes one by one. "So when people say we saved 500 men, I flinch a little. We did what we could that night, and it mattered. But it took everyone here, those who fired the guns, those who held the line, those who worked in aid stations, for those 500 to wake up alive. Fog, mistakes, and stubbornness were all part of it. It was not clean. It was not simple. That is what it was like." There was a silence after he finished, not heavy but thoughtful. The historian nodded, scribbling notes. A local woman dabbed at her eyes. One of the younger soldiers, standing in the back, looked at David with a kind of wary respect, as if seeing not just an old man but the shape of a battered C-47 in his shadow. Later, when the official parts were done, David walked a little way into the trees along the road. The fog that day was light, a thin veil clinging to the low spots. He placed his hand on the rough bark of a trunk and closed his eyes. He imagined, for a moment, that he could hear the distant drone of engines, feel the harness bite into his shoulders again, smell the cold and canvas. He remembered Rodriguez's grin, Lewis's nervous jokes, Johnson's calm calculations. Some had made it home. Some had not. All of them were younger in his memory than his own children were now. He opened his eyes and looked back at the marker. It was small, nearly swallowed by the trees around it, the letters barely visible from the road. It seemed fitting. The actions it commemorated had been almost invisible at the time, swallowed by fog and night, noticed mainly by those who had lived or died because of them. History would keep the headline. "When fog swallowed the skies over Bastogne, my blind night drop delivered ammo that saved 500 men." People would click on it, read a version of events rendered into neat arcs and climaxes. They would not feel the sting of ice in the nostrils or the way a German sentry's final breath had sounded against a gloved hand. But maybe, if the story was told well, they would feel a little of the weight that had hung on those crates, a little of the risk in stepping into the void when every instinct screamed to hold on. Maybe they would understand that in war, salvation sometimes arrived not in perfect plans executed flawlessly, but in imperfect men making the least strong choice in impossible conditions. David turned away from the trees and walked back toward the town, where his wife waited with a thermos and a warm scarf. His knees complained, his breath puffed in soft clouds. Somewhere behind him, the fog thickened briefly, then thinned again, as if acknowledging his presence and letting him pass. He had spent years trying to atone for the men in Normandy who ran out of bullets in a hedgerow. He would never know if the scales had balanced, if that night over Bastogne had truly saved 500 men, or if the number was an estimate wrapped around a story. What he did know was this: when the sky vanished and the instruments lied and fear pressed cold fingers around his heart, he had stepped out of the aircraft anyway. He had walked through the white until he found the work that needed doing and done as much of it as he could. In the end, that was all any soldier in that war could claim. The rest, the fog, the luck, the headlines, belonged to history. If this story moved you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, or if someone in your family served during the Battle of the Bulge. These men jumped into a white void with nothing but a watch and a promise, and their story deserves to be remembered. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you the real history, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks, the kind that shows courage isn't about perfect plans but about stepping into the fog anyway. And please, share this video with someone who loves true war stories. Every share keeps these voices alive and reminds us that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, ordinary people find a way to do something extraordinary.